Hello, my name's Roisin and I'm sick of reading. A few days ago, I saw that Lucy the Reader and Jen Campbell had both uploaded on the same day, within a few hours of each other, a video of comfort reads for this uncomfortable time. And I was inspired to make my own list of reads that I find comforting when all is a bit stressful outside in the world, which is what I personally find very comforting. There are 21 books on this list, and there's definitely a theme. They're mostly classics or historical fiction, which is what I find most comforting personally. But without further ado, I will get into the list, since it's rather a long one. First, I will talk about some classics. The great thing about classics is that they are mostly out of copyright, so it is perfectly easy to find them anywhere online. Your library will probably have them on their online, like whatever app-based thing that they use. So my library, that's BorrowBox, but I know in America a lot of the time that's Libby and Overdrive. Most likely they will be on there. And also, if you can't find them from your library, or you don't have a library card, generally speaking, if you don't have a library card, you can sign up online, and I think some places are extending how long their online sign-ups last before you have to go in and get an actual library card, because of the whole situation, because most libraries are closed. But if you can't find them on your library, you can go to Audible. Audible are currently doing a thing where that a lot of children's books and a lot of classics are now available completely for free to listen to. I will put the link in my description so that you can go to there, because it just can be really helpful to just have them to listen to. Especially, I think that audiobooks, for me personally, can be very comforting, because it's someone reading you a story, which obviously takes most of us back to our childhoods. So, but without further ado, I'll get into the list. So the first one I have on my list is Persuasion by Jane Austen. Any Jane Austen really fits the bill for me. I spent my childhood watching all of the adaptations, and I read all 6 of them when I was about 11 or 12. All 6 of her completed novels I read when I was about 11 or 12. So they definitely have a nostalgic place in my heart. They're comedies, so they're quite light. They definitely explore some serious themes, but they do so with a very light touch. And also, there's no swearing, there's no sex, there's no violence. It's all by a calm environment. And Persuasion is probably her best novel. I mean, Pride and Prejudice or Persuasion, but I love Persuasion, so I would give that a go. The next one I have here is A Room with a View by Ian Forster. Ian Forster is similar to Jane Austen in that sort of sardonic style, and the comedy, they're very funny. There's a whole bit in Room with a View where people are running around naked. It's great. A Room with a View is my favourite Ian Forster. I've only read A Room with a View or And Passage to India, but A Room with a View is lovely. And also the Merchant Ivory film with Helena Bonham Carter and Maggie Smith. Maybe I will make a sequel to this, which is all my comforting films, but a lot of them will be adaptations to these books. And then also I have Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I know a lot of people really loved the recent adaptation. I did too, although I think I'd have to watch it again in order to really love it. The 1994 version with Winona Ryder, which is the one that has a place in my heart. So I think I have to watch it again. And that leads me nicely on to my children's classics, because I think that Little Women is kind of a bridge. It's sold as 2 volumes in the UK, so Little Women itself is quite a young one, and then Good Wives is more adult, so when you put them together it kind of bridges the gap. But the rest of these, my children's ones, are, well, the other one that bridges the gap is His Dark Materials by Phillip Pullman, which is a modern children's classic, and I'm not sure you'll be able to find that so easily. Your library may have access to it, but it is one of the best children's fantasy series ever, and for me it's a comforting read because I read them when I was like 10 and have reread them so many times. The world feels really at home, even though there's a lot of difficult things that happen, and when I first read them when I was about 10, I definitely didn't understand the 3rd book for quite a lot of it. But it's definitely a really immersive world that you can get lost into and forget all about what's going on. And so the more classic children's classics, I have Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This is a whole series, and I think I've only read the first 3. I mean, some people find her really annoying, but if you don't find her really annoying, it's just lovely to be on Prince Edward Island and just disasters of dyeing your hair green and falling off a roof, which sounds horrible, but it's not that bad, and getting your best friend drunk accidentally. It's all just very charming and quaint, and lots of nice descriptions of nature and thoughts about how to be positive, and so it's quite another quite tranquil just wholesome book. I think a lot of what I need right now is wholesome books, and that definitely falls under this category. And I also have The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, another adaptation with Maggie Smith, actually, that's very good. This is so magical. There's colonialism and racism in the beginning, definitely, when they're in India, but when they move to Yorkshire, it's a bit less of that, and it's just really lovely. I haven't read it in years, so I don't know if maybe it's worse than I remember and I shouldn't really be recommending it. But for me, the whole theme of the garden and nature and of becoming a better person, because you realise that other people are people too, that is all really lovely, and it makes me want to live on the moors in a house and just garden. I also have The Moomins by Tove Janson. I definitely watched the anime when I was a kid more than I read the books, but my mum bought me 2 of the graphic novels for Christmas one year, and they are absolutely lovely. They're also very wholesome, but a bit weird, which is exactly up my street. Just charming, really. The drawings are charming, and the stories are charming. And then I will have 2 good bears. First off, Paddington. Paddington 1 and 2 are actually my partner's favourite films of all time. Now, he's not a big film buff, but they are excellent films, and the books are equally as charming and lovely. Just a bear getting up to mishaps but trying to be a good person. And then also Winnie the Pooh, another bear who gets into trouble but is basically just a charming little bear, and it's all about friendship and working together and doing things for your friends, which I think is lovely. So moving on from children's books, I have some non-fiction now. Generally speaking, most of my comfort reads are fiction because you can lose yourself in another world, but I do think there is some non-fiction that can be equally as comforting. So the first one I have on my list is Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. This is all about creativity and how to be creative. It's very self-aware, like it is a bit woo-woo and like ideas floating around and you'll lose them if you don't use them and things like that, but it's self-aware of that woo-woo-ness, and listening to the audiobook especially, her voice is just so lovely. I really enjoy listening to her talk about magic, and it feels really inspiring. And as we've all got a little more time than we thought we would right now, a little more time on our own to spend in a creative process, listening to a book that will spark some creativity in you is definitely something I would recommend. Then I also have Natural Selection, A Year in the Garden by Dan Pearson. I've talked about this book in so many videos since I read it. It is a book that is a collection of Dan Pearson's gardening columns for The Observer. It's just about gardening and growing plants and noticing nature change. And although most of us can't go outside much, I think that when we can go outside, taking time to notice the small things, the little changes, because in the Northern Hemisphere it's spring and in the Southern Hemisphere it's autumn. So both times of change where you can notice a lot of things changing. So taking time to notice buds on trees and new blossom and new leaves, or taking time to notice the changing colour of the leaves and the lengthening or shortening of the days depending on which hemisphere you live in, can be really lovely. If you happen to live in the tropics, let me know what that's like at this time of the year. Let me know if there is changes in your world now. And reading nature writing, I think, can be helpful in bringing yourself down to that level of things that always happen, the seasons, the rotational change of the year, the way that some things, nature, is just carrying on as normal whilst everything feels so difficult and changeable and completely not what we were expecting. Some things still happen the way they were always going to, and I find that can be very grounding. And also this book itself is just so lovely, well written. I mean, I love watching Gardener's World, so if you like things like Gardener's World, I think reading a book about it can be really just as calming and comforting. Then I also have New and Selected Poems Volume 1 is the one that's on my shelf, but any Mary Oliver poems I would really recommend at this time. She's one of my favourite poets. She's one of the most popular poets. The way she writes about nature, she writes about things like this actually, things about feeling uncertain and your whole world changing and how nature is consistent, and things that sort of connect the 2 last books that I talked about, Big Magic and Natural Selection, things about seasonal change, but also things about going inside and loving the wild animal of yourself. This time, when everything has changed, can be an excellent time for reflection. Things you were just doing on autopilot, how useful are they? How helpful are they to you? Are there things that you can now, you've been forced to have space to reflect? Not everyone. I know some people are still emergency workers and are busier now than they have ever been, and I really appreciate the work that you are doing if that is you. But if not, you have been given space to reflect. I think can help us to work on ourselves, like take time to go inside, wrap into a cocoon and think. And by working on yourself, I don't mean like learning new things, taking on massive new projects, becoming incredibly productive. I mean thinking about the way that things we've run on autopilot or automatic responses that we have grown as defense mechanisms and whether they are serving us now. Taking the time to really explore ourselves. If you have the time and if you have the opportunity, I think it can be a really good way to use this time, and it can be a way to make this time less scary. Treating it like a deep breath rather than holding your breath, I think, can be really helpful. And then the other one that I have is kind of seasonally inappropriate, but it's the Christmas Chronicles by Nigel Slater. The way that he writes about food and the way that he writes about winter is just gorgeous. It's so lovely and comforting, and all of the food in there is comfort food because it's Christmas time food, so it's food for when it's cold and you're inside all the time, so it's exactly the perfect thing to read about now. And for me personally, I find Christmas very comforting. I adore Christmas, and thinking about things like Christmas can be a really pleasant experience for me and a way to get away from what the time is now. If you don't like Christmas, I'm sorry, you can read something else. Finally, I have more recent books. Some are historical fiction, some are YA. Next on my list, I have The Gracekeepers by Kirsty Logan, which is kind of a post-apocalyptic novel, almost, but definitely not in the vein of many post-apocalyptic novels. It's if the sea levels rose so high that most people lived on tiny islands, and then some people lived on boats, and it's about a travelling circus on a boat that goes around the world and visits people who live on land, and then also what people do with their dead when that's the experience of the world, when you can't bury them because there's not enough land, and you can't burn them because there's not enough wood. But it's so still, this novel. There's not a lot of plot. There is plot, but it's not very fast paced. But it's so beautiful, and there's a queer relationship in it, and it's lovely. Beauty by Robin McKinley is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. That is probably my favourite Beauty and the Beast retelling. I've read it through so many times. It is fairly straightforward Beauty and the Beast. There's not that much of a twist. Not the Disney version. There's no talking clocks or wardrobes, but there are spirits. Just incredibly beautifully written. I love the way she writes, and it is very light fantasy. So if you're not a huge fantasy person, it would still work for you. I also have The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger, which is a very light sci-fi. I think it was Drinking by My Shelf who talked about how someone else, who I can't remember, had coined the term sci-fi realism, which is what they put The Time Traveller's Wife in. And it's a love story between a man who accidentally time travels, kind of like narcolepsy, but time travel, and the woman that he falls in love with. And it's also about finding a cure and gene science and what it's like to be so close to someone but constantly missing them. It is really well written. I really love it, and the characters are lovely, and the love story is a really beautiful love story. Then Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. This is a book about a girl, Katha, who goes to university, and she writes fan fiction about basically Draco and Harry, but for this sort of imaginary fantasy series. I skipped all of the actual fan fiction bits because fan fiction are not really my thing, especially when I haven't actually read the book. It just felt a bit weird to me. But I do really enjoy the way it deals with anxiety and the way it talks about mental health, which is really good. If you are feeling anxious now, maybe it wouldn't be the best time because of the way that it portrays that. But the romance and the grounding of Levi, I think, is really helpful, and it's just a really cute story. Also, The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, another fantasy historical fiction about a circus. Apparently that's something I enjoy. Didn't realise that until right now. It's beautiful. It's one of the most beautifully descriptive books. One of those books that you can truly imagine on the page. I feel like I've seen the film, even though there isn't one. The ending is a little confusing. No matter how many times I read it, I'm never really sure what happened. But I do still think it is worth reading and is definitely perfect escapism. Also, The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry, which is sort of pseudo-fantasy. There's no actual fantasy, but there's talk about fantasy in a way, and you're never quite sure. It's a historical fiction novel about a woman whose abusive husband has just died, and she is obsessed with Mary. Oh God, I can't remember her name, but the fossil hunter. And it's about a time in Victorian times where they started to discover fossils of dinosaurs, but they didn't know that much about it, and they thought that so many mystical creatures could exist because they found these giant bones and these huge lizards, and they thought, well, if that exists, what else exists? Side note, where I'm from, in Crystal Palace, there was a Victorian the Great Exhibition set up by Victoria and Albert, spent a year in Hyde Park, and then moved to Crystal Palace. It's called Crystal Palace because there was a glass palace built there. And in the grounds of this glass palace, there was these... they built these legs and they built models of dinosaurs, but they're like what Victorians thought dinosaurs looked like, so they're not accurate at all, but they are brilliant. So I grew up with the dinosaurs, so maybe that's why the Essex Serpent spoke to me, but I love all the characters and the interactions, and I think it's really good for escapism because it is, again, that sort of historical, so you're taking yourself out of time but also taking yourself out of the real world, and it is so beautifully descriptive. I think for a fiction novel to really take me out of the world, it needs to be so descriptive that I feel truly immersed in that world. And I also have The Mermaid and Mrs Hancock along a similar vein. That was one of my favourite books that I read last year. It is set in the 18th century about a merchant and a courtesan, and the merchant's ship captain brings him back a mermaid. Not an actual mermaid, a curiosity, although there is some fantasy towards the second half of the book, but it's so deliciously descriptive and you really feel immersed in the 18th century, and I just love all the characters. Angelica is silly, but I love her so much. And then finally, Chocolat by Joanne Harris, another one where the movie is equally as good, and it's about a mother and daughter travellers, I guess they would be, and they come and move to this town where the mayor is very strict about religious things, and they set up a chocolate shop in Lent, and it's all about their experience living in this little French town and selling chocolate, and it's really just so fun, light-hearted. It's a little bittersweet, like dark chocolate, but it's definitely worth the read. So that is my list of 21 books that I find comforting. Let me know your favourite comfort reads in the comments down below, and also let me know if you fancy reading any of these. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again the day after tomorrow. Bye bye.